Welcome to Exploring Computing. Today's video is working with files. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to read from files and write to files. And so this is going to greatly increase your capacity to create useful Python programs. So let's go ahead and start off by seeing how to open files. So it's really pretty straightforward. We just go ahead and say open. We pass in the name of the file that we want to work with. And that file is going to be located in the same location as your Python file. So wherever you save your Python file, that's where you can expect the data file to appear if you're creating a new data file, or that's where your data file should be placed if you're planning to read from the file. Okay, so open the name of the file. Notice that is a string. Followed by a second string, which is going to tell Python if we're going to read from the file or write from it. Use a string with just an R character in it if we're going to read, and just a string with a W character in it if we're going to write. And so that whole open will return a value which we can use to access the file. All right, now if we try to read from a file that doesn't exist, Python's actually going to give us an error message when we try and run it. If we try to write to a file that doesn't exist, Python will create a new file. And if we write to a file that is already there, that already does exist, Python will overwrite it. So be careful that you don't write to a file that you care about the contents, because it will get overwritten if you tell Python to write to it. Okay, once you're done with the file, you should explicitly close it. So you do this by using the name of the variable which refers to the file, followed by a dot or period, followed by close. Probably the easiest way to read from files is to use the for loops, which we saw last lecture. So in this first example, we're going to take a look at how to read from a file and add a series of numbers that are found within the file. This is going to turn out to be quite similar to the program that we saw in the previous lecture, where we added up all the numbers in a list, but there is a little bit of extra messiness here. So you can see up at the top, I start off by opening up the file. In this case, I always open up the file name data.txt, and I'm opening up to read from the file. I am not going to write from the file. And then at the bottom, I go ahead and close the file. Now, this middle section here looks pretty similar to what we saw in the previous lecture, where we looped through all the items in a list and added them all together. And we're actually going to take a look at a direct comparison in just a second. There is one difference here, though, and that is we need to explicitly convert the whatever we're reading from the file into an integer. We could also convert it to a floating point number if we want it. And this is because when we read from a file, Python always treats whatever we've read from the file as a string. Okay, so here's an example which we could actually run. And so on the right, I have the actual data file, and then we've got our code on the left. And so the way this is going to work is, well, we've got a little for loop there, for line in data file, and line is initially going to be set to 100, then it's going to be set to 200, then it's going to be set to 150, and then it's going to be set to 400. And other than that, this will work exactly like the previous example of. If you have trouble understanding that, you should take a look at the previous video on for loops. All right, so when this is all done, this is going to print out 850. And here's a direct comparison between our example from last lecture and today's lecture. And you can see that the code is almost exactly the same. Obviously, in our code for today, we are opening up the file and we are closing it. And I will have to admit I changed the print statement. So one of them prints total is, and the other one just prints the total. But other than that, and the fact that we are explicitly converting the data from the file to an integer, because again, when we read the data from the file, Python is going to treat it as a string, not a number. So I do need to do that conversion. All right, so it is possible to read from a file outside of a loop. This gets a little bit messier, but this can definitely be useful in certain circumstances. And so you can see here, I open up the data file, same as before, and then there's this data file.read line, and that will read the current line in the file. It will return it as a string, and we can do something with it. In this particular case, I'm converting it to a floating point number because, again, it would normally be treated as a string. Of course, you may want to treat it as a string. We'll actually talk about that next lecture with the issues with treating it as a string are. After we read the last line of the file, the next line we try and read, there won't be another next line because we've reached the end of the file. What you'll actually get back from the read line is what's referred to as the empty string. This is a string with no characters in it. You may wonder what happens if you have an empty line in the file a little bit earlier in the file. So maybe I've got 3 lines with people's names in it. I've got 2 blank lines, then I've got a couple more lines with people's names on it. It's actually going to turn out when you read a line from Python and it's blank, you're actually going to get that carriage return character. Remember when we talked about ASCII, we talked about how there we talked about how there are several different ways to encode the end of the line with a new carriage return. And you're actually going to get that carriage return character read back from you from the file. And again, we will talk about this next lecture, what it means, what it looks like, and what to do about it. So what about writing to a file? So writing to a file is pretty straightforward. We can go ahead and open the file for writing. We can say datafile.write, or whatever the name of your variable is that's storing a reference to the file .write, and then whatever the string you want to write to it is. And again, you should close it when you're done. If you do forget to close it, on some systems, you won't actually get any output in the file. What can happen is the computer can sort of save up all the stuff that you're writing to the file and not actually write it to the file until you explicitly close the file. So do make sure that you explicitly close the file. And just as a reminder, if the file does not exist, opening a file for writing will create it, whereas opening a non-existent file for reading will give you an error message. And if a file does exist and you open it for writing, you are going to overwrite the current contents of that file. All right, there's another little issue that you're going to run into if you start writing to a file. So here I've opened the file stanford.txt for writing, and I've written to the file twice. I've written go Stanford and go Cardinal, and if we were actually to open up the file, what we would see is go Stanford, go Cardinal, all on the same line. We'll see how to fix this in the next lecture, but I just wanted to mention here if you were to go ahead and try to do the right here. So let's take a look at a couple more examples of increasing complexity. In this first case, I'm going to go ahead and average the numbers in a file. This will be similar to something we saw last lecture, but again, it's got some complexities that we'll need to deal with. So in the last example, we just always opened the file called data.txt. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and ask the user what the name of the file they want us to open is, and then I will go ahead and call open on that particular file name. The center section here, I go ahead and set total equal to 0, and then I go ahead and iterate through all the lines in the file. This is basically what we did a minute ago, very similar. But the little wrinkle here in this case is last time when we determined the average of the numbers in a list, we needed to determine how many items were in the list, and there was that length function. We just called length on the list itself, and it would tell us how long it is. That's not the case on a file. If I want to know how many lines there are in a file, I'm going to have to determine it myself. And so here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to use a variable called number. I'm going to set the initial value to number to 0. So initially we haven't seen any numbers yet. And then in the middle of my for loop, notice that's indented. So this is something that's going to happen for each line in the file. I'm going to add 1 to the number. So initially number will be 0. When we see the first line, I'll say number equals number plus 1. So number will go to 1. And the next time I run it, number will be 1. I add 1 to it, it'll be 2. I add 1 to it, it'll be 3, and so on. And when we're all done, number should be the number of lines that we've actually read from the file. And then we can just go ahead and take our total and divide that by the number. All right, let's take a look at an even more complicated example. So this is going to determine how many adults we have and how many children we have. And if we have anybody who's 17, my apologies, we're going to count you as a child for the purposes of this program. But you know, if this were a movie theater or something, hopefully you get a slightly cheaper ticket. Okay, so I opened the file at the beginning. I asked the user what file name they want to use. So again, it's a slightly more complicated than what we've seen before, where I just always open the same file name. And then when we're done, we need to remember to close it. Okay, up at the top, after I've opened the file, I go ahead and initialize my variables. And this is super, super common. We've seen this in the last couple examples. This is a very common technique. So We are processing individual items in the list. We're trying to get data about those individual items in the list. And I need to store the results in some variables. And before I start the loop, before I start processing each of the lines in the list or each of the lines in the file, I need to initialize those values. So in this case, I'm keeping track of the number of adults. I'm keeping track of the number of children. And before I process any of those lines, the total of each is going to be 0. And then you can see what I'm doing here is I'm looking at each of the individual ages in the data file. And if that age is greater than or equal to 18, then I'm saying, hey, I have one more adult than however many adults I have seen previously prior to processing this particular line of the data file. And if the age is less than 18, then however many children I've seen so far, I have one more child. And so you can kind of think that through. And at the end of all of this, you can see that the adults variable should store the number of ages we've seen over 18 or older. I always got to remember that whether that's greater than or equal to or greater than. In this case, it's greater than or equal to. If it's your 18th birthday today, congratulations, you count as adult. We're going to charge you more money to enter our theater. And then we know how many children we have at the end, so we just go ahead and print those two out. Okay, that's it for our discussion on files. You guys will get to play around a little bit with this in your next homework assignment.